laws were left unattended in the original foundation. She then said, America is an old house. This particular analogy, because of the aforementioned, just hit different with me. And I immediately ordered the book because I'm white, and explaining white privilege to people without folks getting on the defensive, because admitting that you have privilege and have contributed to something, it's hard. And this analogy is perfect for that, because it's like none of us created the system, but if we ignore the things that are wrong with it, then it's on us. And I learned in reading this book that this analogy was far from unique to the US. I learned that just as we have a tendency to export our casteism as we inhabit other parts of the globe, like during wars when we have military go places, like those, you know, the racism within the military doesn't stop just because we're in Europe or in the Middle East. I learned that there is casteism imported here as part of the South Asian diaspora and other countries that also have caste systems. And then shortly after I started reading the book, I found out that my wonderful friend, Senator Aisha Wahab, had introduced Senate Bill 403, which would prohibit discrimination on the basis of caste in the state of California. And after that, some of the attacks and talking points that I started to hear were eerily familiar. And I didn't understand, but then I did, why these talking points were happening to what is in fact a history-making piece of civil rights legislation. So that's why we're here. That's why we're having this discussion, so that people who look like me can learn to be more knowledgeable and effective allies in dismantling these systems, and particularly with helping get this bill passed. And so the people who don't look like me can learn about folks who are fighting these battles worldwide, just like we are here, and hopefully come away with a broader feeling of solidarity and a shared battle for human rights. Because we're not alone. This is all of our fight. So joining us today are amazing panelists, Thenmozhi Soundararajan and Professor Kevin Brown. Thenmozhi is a Dalit civil rights activist, artist, organizer, and theorist. She's the executive director of Equality Labs, which is a national Dalit civil rights organization working on caste, race, and gender equity, and is the author of The Trauma of Caste. Professor Brown is a 1982 graduate of Yale Law School. Here I was born. Woo woo. An original participant in the original participant in the critical race theory workshop in Madison, Wisconsin in 1989. And for 36 years, his primary research interests are in the areas of race, law, and education, and transnational inequality. He has published 2 books and over 90 articles or comments on issues, including comparisons of struggles of Blacks in the US with those of Dalits in India. He has numerous other publications regarding the relationship between the African-American struggle and that of Dalits in India. He has a special relationship to the Dalit struggle because he was born on October 14th, 1956, India time. He was a Fulbright lecturer in India from December 1996 to May 1997. And in addition, he has led 3 different groups of primarily American legal scholars on journeys through India to participate in over a dozen conferences and several additional academic exchanges that focused on comparing the struggles of African Americans and Dalits. So welcome, Thenmozhi and Professor Brown. I am going to have the spotlight just Thenmozhi and Professor Brown. So the rest of the conversation shall be the disembodied voice from the background as we move through some of these questions. So just to kick this all off, what is the definition of caste? What does that term mean?
Well, thank you so much for sharing that, and thank you so much for everybody that's joining. It's been an incredible process to work with leadership from the the Democratic Progressive Caucus, and who's really been so welcoming to caste oppressed people across California. So it's really an amazing thing to keep deepening our relationship through these conversations. So I think the way to best understand caste, particularly as we've been working and building this conversation with relationship to the bill SB 403, is caste systems are global systems that are based on hierarchy and discrimination based on birth, work, and descent. And, you know, there are many caste systems around the world, like you mentioned, Isabel Wilkerson's work, who kind of popularized that idea into the American conversation. But we actually have a long history of caste oppressed people from around the world kind of building their relationships. And I think where we get our intergovernmental mandate and where we started to learn and build a collective, you know, theory around this work was really at the UN gathering in Durban to eliminate racism and discrimination. And out of that came this historic treaty, you know, the Convention to Eliminate Racism and All Forms of Discrimination, of which the US is a signatory to. And underneath that, it says under Article 29, caste systems are these systems that discriminate on birth, work, and descent. And so based on that, you know, there are many, you know, communities that experience this kind of discrimination, which has elements of, you know, being discriminated in part because of your lineage, being discriminated because of some of your traditional occupation, and even like, you know, who you can marry, where you might live. I myself am a member of the South Asian American community, and we are certainly encasted, and I come from a caste oppressed background in that context. And certainly there is a great deal of violence, exclusion, and discrimination that occurs. And in my work at Equality Labs, you know, we conducted a survey, one of the first surveys that documented caste discrimination in the United States. And we found that 1 in 4 caste oppressed people faced physical and verbal assault, 1 in 3 educational discrimination, and 2 out of 3 workplace discrimination. And that data has been followed by many other data sets that confirm both the existence of caste, whether that's found in the Carnegie Report, which found 80% of people who, you know, identified there with a caste background did so of a high caste background, to the study of Nepali Dalits in the Bay Area who were caste oppressed, who spoke quite poignantly of the discrimination that they faced. You know, these aren't just about work, you know, these aren't just about like hurt feelings. It's about serious structural violence. We're talking about people being trafficked. We're talking about people facing wage theft, disparate hiring processes, sexual harassment, and even termination, not to mention housing discrimination and discrimination in educational environments, all of which are unlawful, both under civil rights law, but also in terms of labor law. And that's why Senator Aisha Wahab worked to so, you know, just courageously back this bill, because it makes complete sense to make sure that we are working to make explicit protections for caste oppressed people when such significant discrimination is occurring. And it's vital for us, I think, as Californians to understand our notions of race are becoming globalized, as who we are as Californians now have many different points of origins. So that's really like how I really want to encourage people to think about caste. It's not just about one race, one ethnicity, you know, even people who practice like a particular religion. It's about understanding communities that are impacted by these global systems of discrimination based on work, birth, and descent. And certainly there are caste oppressed people from the South Asian context who identify as Dalit, but you have the Burakum people from Japan. You have tribes in Africa that also experience this untouchability, from Somalia to Zimbabwe to Mali to even communities in Latin America and Europe. So it's fundamentally a global category. And the more that we understand this problem, the more that we understand the legal tools we need to solve it.
And so one of the things that made explaining, Vinny Bacon is going to come on here, but you know, he's from Fremont, and you know, he's in Aisha's district, and we were talking about 403 when it first came out, and I found myself able to explain to him what kind of discrimination lower caste people were facing, who were not it wasn't the, American Black caste system. It was, folks in a diaspora, because I had this understanding of the kind of discrimination that Black people face and have always faced in the United States. So, Professor Brown, what makes the United States a caste system, and how are those discussions intertwined with the discussion of caste with regard to like legal protections? What makes us a caste system?
Okay, let me start by saying I'm really honored to be here. This is a very, very important issue for literally hundreds of millions of people across the world, and I'm very glad that you're having this webinar. What I'm going to do is to talk about the concept of caste discrimination as it's understood for federal anti-discrimination law. You just heard a very good explanation of caste and how it functions in the global context, in the international context. Of course, it also functions in South Asia. I want to change the context, and I'm talking primarily about U.S. federal anti-discrimination law and how this caste issue plays itself out for our anti-discrimination law. And really that starts with a recognition that the issue of whether or not caste is a form of race in India actually comes after the debate about caste and race in the US. In the US, as early as the 1830s, abolitionists were arguing that the treatment of Black people here, both those who were enslaved as well as those who were free, was similar to the caste system that existed in South Asia. The abolitionists were making that argument because they were against both slavery, but they were also against the discrimination that free Black people were experiencing in the North as well as in the South. So in the 1830s, abolitionists start to analogize the treatment of Black people to the Indian caste system. And then when we get, of course, to the end of the Civil War, after the end of the Civil War between 1865 and 1877, the United States is going to pass 5 major civil rights bills and 3 amendments to the Constitution, all of which now to deal with the new legal protections which are being provided for the freed but former enslaved Black people. And the basis of what those laws were to do, it was constantly asserted by the members of Congress that what we're trying to do with our anti-discrimination laws that we're passing is to prevent the development of a caste system like what existed in India. Now, certainly they didn't understand the ins and outs of the caste system the way it played itself out in South Asia. They really understood caste primarily in terms of a system where you're dealing with discriminating against someone based on their ancestry, and there's a hierarchy built into it. So for us, caste and race come together, and they really stay together throughout the entire 19th century. And indeed, even today, you will hear people talk about America's system as a caste system. And that's why I go back to Emma. When Emma said, well, I'm hearing about the caste system and the discrimination that follows, and it sounds eerily similar. Well, the reason it sounds eerily similar is because for 200 years, when the United States had been making the argument that discriminating against someone based on effectively their ancestry is a form of race discrimination. So the way caste is really understood under our legal system is much simpler than it's understood in the international community as well as in South Asia. For us, it's really more the discrimination based on involuntary characteristics that someone is born into with the concept of hierarchy. But I should add, given the Supreme Court's most recent affirmative action decision, our concepts of race discrimination are no longer rooted even in hierarchy. They're just simply discriminating against someone based on their ancestry.
Yeah, it's it's the eye opening of this concept is just, it still blows my mind.
Can I let me just to follow that up. You see, the reason this is such a, in some sense, the caste discrimination is such a huge issue for us, but it's also an issue that virtually any American you would go to and you say, look, I've explained the caste system to you. I've explained how it discriminates against others. 99% of Americans are going to say that's wrong. And it's because our traditions are about individuals being able to pursue their own desires without being prevented to do that by characteristics that they don't choose. So in one way, caste is really something very easy for Americans to understand. But in another way, when we're trying to understand the experience from South Asia or the international community, that, which is something very important for us to understand, but it's separate from how caste is going to be treated under U.S. anti-discrimination law.
And I think, Emma, you know, one thing which I think is really important for the caucus to really think about is that, you know, it is such an intensely human process to want to be humanized with the rest of the people that you are part of a society with. And some of the intense debate and conversations that we're seeing around this bill, like with what Professor Brown just said, you know, and that, you know, if you just explain to people what the system is, this is something we don't want. And yet every time we have developed a protected category, and the category of race is like one of the most fundamental, and this is what I love about Professor Brown's research, is that to you know, the discussion, it's not like, you know, while we all here assume that we understand racism, the battle to get race as a protected category was unending and vicious and violent. And Professor Brown's scholarship has really shared how so much of the discussion of race in US law was intertwined with discussions of caste. And, you know, that's where I think, you know, later scholars kind of like, you know, take the history of what Professor Brown has done and popularize it. But Professor Brown really was that first scholar who spoke about that. And that really touches me because in many ways, you saw Black abolitionists making these arguments, we're human, we're human, we're human, we're human. By the way, we're human. And the opponents to the category of race would go back to these discussions of the caste system to say, well, there's no caste here. You know, and that to me tells me why we're so intertwined as movements, is that in many ways, oppressed people are always seeing other oppressed people. We build precedent off of each other, and we also link our shared power with each other as we try to free ourselves together, you know?
Well, I'm actually going to skip ahead really quick because that totally touched upon one other thing we were talking about, where it's like constantly fighting against, you know, it's that concept of like, you know, equality in the face of an unbalanced system feels like oppression for the people who are the dominant caste or class. And I was wondering, you know, what are some of the less obvious and unseen dynamics of how caste discrimination works in the US? Like, we have the obvious, you know, we have redlining throughout history, we have, you know, slavery, we have police brutality, we have the incarceral system, and what are some of the more unseen dynamics of that, and how does that play into what ultimately winds up in a poor or working class white electorate really driving this continued division and this continued enforcement of a caste system that they're suffering from the same policies that everyone else is? And it would be the same thing, you know, with members of the South Asian diaspora. It's like, what drives that? What is the dynamic that drives that?
Well, I think there's a lot of factors that drive it, but I think one of the things I always think about is that you can change the law, but you also have to change hearts and minds. And the hearts and minds factor is related to historical trauma. Has it actually been healed? And our understanding that the battle to keep the healing going is not a simple one, where it's not like, okay, 1967 civil rights law is passed, like, okay, racism is in the rearview mirror, let's go. We can see, as we saw with, the retraction of affirmative action, that actually it's a constant battle to retain the very tenuous consensus that we build towards the forward progress of civil rights. And I think that, when you think about there is a very long history for the battle of caste abolition. And I think that what we've seen in the conversations related to SB 403 is we finally have, a very powerful statewide apparatus of caste oppressed Californians who are connected to many other civil rights movements that has given the courage for thousands of caste oppressed people to come out of the closet. And I cannot tell you how dramatic that is, because, when I started this work when I was in my 20s, I remember being one of the only people that was out as a Dalit. And many, at that time, I got lots of rape and death threats. There was tons of gaslighting. And there's like this sheer force of bigotry that prevents and denies you from, one, articulating your experience of discrimination, and two, validating that this could be a structure of oppression. It's like the minute that you come out, there is tremendous forces to shut down your humanity. And in fact, I remember when Senator Aisha Wahab reached out about this bill, normally people would be really excited, like, oh my gosh, we're going to create one of the first statewide bills to end caste. And in my heart, I actually grieved a little bit, because I knew how much violence and bigotry and political chaos this was going to unleash on caste oppressed civil rights organizations and leaders and people who support civil rights. But I think that just because something is hard does not mean that we should not do it, and that we don't have a moral obligation to uphold the structures of democracy and justice and equity. And I think that that's the tremendous balance that so many caste oppressed people have to kind of really endure, because we do have all this like structural violence. We do face the loss of our jobs, the loss of our visas, even potentially facing physical violence and worse. Like, I remember this one Dalit who gave a testimony that we have shared with the legislature, who is an Uber driver. He lives in Central Valley and commutes 4 hours a day to work in the Bay Area. But when he comes home, he has a neighbor who is dominant caste, who came up to him after he found out that he was Dalit, and he said, "How dare you immigrate here? How dare you? Back at home, you would be cleaning our toilets, you would be working our fields. I am going to effing kill you." And he said that to him in front of his son, in front of his wife, and he didn't know what to do. He went to the manager didn't know what to do. He went to the police, and he had to go 4 times because the police didn't understand this as a hate crime, because guess what? They don't understand caste. Then he finally was able to get a police report when someone helped him, and then he got to the next stage of getting a restraining order. But he's not a singular case. Like in our case back in our own district where Aisha Wahab lives, I met with people who were in a housing complex where dominant caste people were following this one Dalit man. They would call him Blackie, and they would make gestures like this, saying that they were going to cut his balls. And this is the kind of terror and violence that we're facing. It's actually not unseen. It's that our bodies and the crimes against us are unseen to the laws that govern justice in the state, because there's a lack of clarity in the law. So we need to be embodied. We need to be present in the law. And that's why people have risked the kinds of violence and disinformation and bigotry to come forward, just like every civil rights movement has done. When you think about Martin Luther King being investigated by the FBI, and the kinds of things that happened, like with the murder of Emmett Till, and the kinds of sex crimes that Rosa Parks had to investigate as she got on that bus, we are conscious as Dalit civil rights leaders that we face and endure incredible violence fighting for this bill. And yet, if we didn't do that, we would not be human, and we wouldn't be here as part of this tradition to fight for justice for all people.
Let me I just want to add, and I really don't need to add too many points to what Thenmozhi has just said, because you do see these sort of parallels between Black people that challenged slavery and they were punished for doing that. Black people who challenged segregation were punished for doing that. So you do see those analogies. There's no question about that at all. But to a certain extent, when we're talking about caste discrimination functioning in the US, you don't even have to think about it in terms of, oh, this is terrible for an oppressed people, right? We've seen the Supreme Court's affirmative action case in the Harvard case where it's saying, look, you're discriminating against white people by taking account of race in these admissions process. That is wrong. Right? It's the fact that you're treating someone by a characteristic that they didn't choose that really is sort of the core of the concept of American anti-discrimination law as it's understood today. The one point I want to make, coming back to this issue about race discrimination, today we in the US, when we think about race discrimination, we typically go, well, we have Asians, we have Black people, we have white people, we have Native Americans, and we have Latinx people, right? Those tend to be the concepts that when we think of race, those are the concepts we tend to think of. But here's the issue. Those categories, that notion, that's the racial categories, those five. So there's no real space to talk about Dalits being a different race from upper caste Hindus. That concept of race only comes into existence in the 1970s. This is a very recent concept in American society itself. And when you leave America, nowhere else in the world have I run across a nation where they say we're taking all of the people from the continent of Asia and throwing them into one racial category. Or we're taking all of the people from Latin America or former Spanish-speaking colonies and throwing them into one category. Nowhere else in the world does anyone do that. The concept of race was always much, much broader. We used to think of the Irish as a different race from the Anglo-Saxons, who were a different race from the Mexican Americans, who were a different race from the Puerto Ricans. Right? The concept of race was much more granular for us in the US until the 1970s. So when we look at our federal anti-discrimination law and we think about what was race discrimination, we're to understand what was race discrimination when those laws were passed. The 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1866 Civil Rights Act. And when we think of how race was understood then, it's very easy to see different castes would have been viewed as different racial groups under our understanding about race when we created our anti-discrimination law. And once again, that's why, in a way, some of this is so familiar for us as Americans. You heard what Thenmozhi said. 99% of Americans would say that kind of treatment is wrong. And it's wrong whether you're a Dalit doing it to a Brahmin, or a Brahmin doing it to a Dalit, or a Black person doing it to a white person, or a white person doing it to a Black person. It is wrong to discriminate against someone for those characteristics like race and caste that they don't choose. And that's really all that the Dalits are asking for, is the legal protection that the discrimination against them is recognized as illegal. Emma.
Emma, you might be muted. Are you speaking?
Yeah.
Emma?
Hold
on.
Yeah.
Emma, you muted? Hold on. Let me try to find Emma here. Emma, we can't hear you.
I had to reclaim host from you. I forgot I wasn't a co-host. So I did. I took it by force. It keeps me, thinking about, as far as like, violence between these, the violence between, violent mentality, whatever, but, between Puerto Ricans and Cubans and, and South Asian castes. And it brings my brain back to the concept of like proximity to whiteness in the US. And how much of that do you think governs, as far as like the immigration policies in the United States and who we were willing to classify as white and who we weren't willing to classify as white and how that's changed through the decades? What bearing do you think that has on the prevalence of caste discrimination, South Asian caste discrimination in the United States, where there is this dynamic of proximity to whiteness, and it's like, are you going to be seen in the eyes of the United States caste system as closer to the subordinate class or closer to the dominant caste? I think that plays a role in this pushback and in this prevalence of the discrimination here. Wait, are you unmuted now? How are you unmuted? Oh my Lord. Hold on. Oh, ask to unmute.
Okay, great.
There we go.
There we go. So I think there's like a couple of things kind of wrapped up in your question, Emma. So first of all, I think picking up from what Professor Brown said, what it meant for Americans from different countries of origin to become racialized is actually pretty profound. Like that racialization, kind of flattened our identity, but it didn't flatten all of the critical tensions and historical traumas that we have, especially extreme conditions of violence. And in the South Asian context, we have long historical traumas related to genocide, related to, caste apartheid, to the development of our nation states, which also had lots of unhealed violence. So as a result, like ethnic groups like people who are Bangladeshi Californian or Pakistani Californian or Indian American or people who are of Indo-Fijian and Indo-Caribbean backgrounds, we all don't have the same historical experience and actually have historical traditions of violence that we're still grappling and mending or inflaming. And I think what has happened, amongst many, and we're just a small microcosm of what's happening across many different racial groups, is that what the right wing does is that I think while 2020 elections were all about, radicalized white nationalists and the right wing, I think 2024 is going to be about the right wing everywhere. And so certainly in the South Asian community, you have radicalized elements where these fault lines are being weaponized, just like you do within the Asian American community, so that you have a small group of people that then go against civil rights consensus issues like affirmative action, like critical race theory, like reproductive justice, I mean, in a normal situation, we would be excited about there being a brown candidate in the race, especially someone who's South Asian, except this person is spouting the worst talking points, making fun of and undermining all of the civil rights victories that we've ever had. And this is where racial politics will not be sufficient. We need to have ideological coherence. Are we really on the same moral and values platforms? Because, as many, Black civil rights folks have talked about for many years, not all of our, skin folks are our kin folks. And, and that's really to say that it won't be enough to have racial coherency. We actually really need to talk about what is our values aligned platforms. And I think this was something that we saw in the South Asian community very much under the Trump administration, because we actually saw upper caste Indian Americans who were co-signing to Trump's agenda related to building his wall. And I know that this confused many Asian American and other immigrant rights activists. They were like, why are there people who are saying, you know, that real dreamers are fake and that they're the legal dreamers and that they'll pay for expedited green cards to pay for Trump's wall? Well, it's because a lot of those people were actually against affirmative action in India for caste oppressed people, and they use dog whistles that are casteist dog whistles to talk about other communities of color. So they say, we're immigrants of merit. We pay our taxes, we're not criminals, therefore we should be getting better than those who broke the law. And that kind of pitting of oppressed communities is very common, not just under racial systems, but under caste systems. And it's actually at the heart of the origin of the South Asian racial categorization, because some of the first South Asians who are kind of challenging the racist immigration laws, you know, whether it was Bhagat Singh Thind or A.K. Mozumdar, when they would make arguments as to why they were being denied citizenship, because at that time only white people could be citizens, they argued, well, we're actually brown white people. Like literally what you were saying, Emma, about white adjacency, they argued we are brown white people because we're upper caste. And in fact, Bhagat Singh Thind went even further to say he would support miscegenation laws and that he would never sleep or be with someone who was of an indigenous background in the South Asian context. So the tie of what it means to be a model minority, where you throw other communities of color in the bus, where you support carceral policies, and also, embrace a paradigm of exclusion, that is a choice that all of our communities can take. But I think that what we're trying to say in a place like the Progressive Caucus is what binds us is a unity towards the commitment of civil rights, environmental justice, and the moral possibility of what it means for us to be connected more than it is for us to be isolated and apart. And I think that's the challenge, you know, and this is why, you know, Senator Aisha Wahhab's support around SB 403 is so incredible, because no freshman senator who didn't have ovaries of steel could take on a bill this insane in terms of the opposition, because for what is a very perfunctory bill, you know, we're not changing the law, we're making it explicit, and there's no cost to the state. It simply is protecting a very vulnerable community that is asking for a remedy to discrimination. And the tempest in the teapot that has led to such violent bigotry, because keep in mind, her office faced rape threats and death threats. She was called a jihadist. People followed her staff to their cars. I know that members of our organization and myself have been targeted by disinformation. People called us the Klan. People said that we were terrorists. In one community meeting, people called us weapons of mass destruction, that we're evil. It's just an incredible amount of desecrating violence. And yet, you know, that seems to be the gauntlet we force the most vulnerable Americans to go through to prove that they're human. And what we have to do is understand the kind of power that we want to build is to prevent that, you know. And I think that that's why I just want to thank so much the Progressive Caucus for standing with our community, because we went through hell and back to get this bill passed, you know. And Professor Brown, I don't think people realize that his legal scholarship wasn't just about compiling this incredible history. His flanking and his leadership has also led to violence against him as well. And yet, you know, this is what we do. We are people who want to ensure that the freedom isn't just for us. It's that until all people are free, none of us are free. And that joint solidarity has been incredible.
Yeah, let me, and believe me, Thenmozhi, that's not a problem for me. They really come after me more for the critical race theory stuff that I've done. But I definitely want to pick up on her points about discrimination and solidarity among groups who have faced it. And I'm now going to speak specifically about the relationship of the Black community in the U.S. to the South Asian community. Because as I said, in the 1830s, we start with this analogy where the abolitionists here are analogizing the treatment of Black people to the caste system. And of course, they are saying whites are like the top caste and Black people are like the bottom caste. And that's where the similarity is. And that will carry on for a very long period of time until we get into the beginnings of the 20th century. Now, what starts to happen in the 20th century then becomes the effort by Indian freedom fighters to push for independence from Britain. So at that point, the people in South Asia, all of them, upper caste as well as low caste as well as Dalits, are all being oppressed by British colonialism. So you see the formation of this major alliance between the Black community here in the United States and the South Asian community, where we are on the same side fighting different forms of white supremacy. We're fighting as the Black community, white supremacy in the form of segregation. The Indian freedom fighters are fighting white supremacy in the form of British colonialism. And the two groups are working together as allies with each other. Indeed, this is the period of time when Gandhi becomes very good friends with a number of leaders in the Black Civil Rights Movement, people like W.B. Du Bois, and many other activists that we had at that time. But from the Black community, the other thing to understand is we also understood the caste system in India, and we understood that there were people at the bottom. So our agreement with the Indian freedom fighters was, you're fighting a dual victory. Not only are you saying you need independence, but once you get independence, you will attack this untouchability. And they do, in fact, get independence, right? And there are a number of provisions in the Indian Constitution to attack untouchability. There's no question about that at all. But they have not gone far enough because, as Thenmozhi pointed out, it's one thing to have laws. It's another thing to change the hearts of people so that they give this up. And to a certain extent, the Black community really feels like we should be allies with both. We should be allies in a collective world struggle against oppression, but that means not just oppression by the dominant white community on people of color, but it also means oppression within our societies. So we would certainly urge our upper caste friends and allies to fight against this form of discrimination on untouchability. Oh, you got to get it.
I muted myself this time. For people who look like me, what is untouchability? Can you explain that to, people who look like me? Oh, why are you? Stop muting yourself.
Okay, thank you. So, I think untouchability is, very painful, I think, for caste oppressed people to speak about. And I really want people to kind of sink into themselves and really just kind of imagine what this means for people. But what it entails essentially is that we were a people that were told that, when we were born into our caste, we had done something in a past life and therefore deserved punishment in this lifetime. And as a result, there's kind of a structural shunning and violence that's associated with that. So we are not allowed to eat from the same pots and vessels as other people. In some of the most excruciating forms of untouchability, we're not allowed to walk on the same road. There's even some castes that have to carry a pot around their neck because if we spit on the road, someone stepping on that could be polluted. So we have to, contain our body effluent. There's even like a group of people that have to, when they walk on their road, their steps, they have to have a broom to wash it because even our footsteps can be defiling to other people. Because to touch us is to be defiled, spiritually defiled. And we are essentially spiritual criminals, people who don't deserve the dignity and a presence before God. And that is the term and the structure of our discrimination. And because of that, we are forced into and sentenced to extreme punishing, backbreaking labor and violence. We clean up the shit of other castes. We have to do backbreaking labor. We have to, dispose of the dead bodies. And that sense of us being polluted and disgusting travels with us when our communities travel here, because even if we might change our profession, people still ritually shun us. And we have colleagues here that are joining us from the Rabadasya community of California, who has been one of the incredible backbones of the California movement. And they have reported that when they first immigrated here and they went to other general, ritual religious spaces, they were told that they could not even cook in the same pots as other people because they would pollute the food, they would pollute for other people. And they were told where to sit, where they could worship, because other people did not want to be in the same space with them. Imagine the pain and the injury when you are not just, desecrated before another human, but even before God. That's the kind of sickness that is accompanied with casteism and that divine justification for us to be dehumanized. And it's not unlike the white Christian nationalism that also provided the foundation for the demonization of African peoples and their pathway to being racialized as Black. There are so many documentations of what disgusting justifications of the ill humors and the lesser than that what Black people, their spirits and their ability to work, and all of that came under a spiritual framework. So it's not even about one religion, but that piece of it is so painful. And that's why people, we never use the term untouchable. We view it as a slur, but yep. People choose other terms. They might use the term Dalit, which means one who is broken or resilient. Some people choose to identify as a different religion that is explicitly caste abolitionist, like those who are Rabadasya or Buddhist. But I think the point is that whatever the name, people are trying everything that they can to reclaim their humanity. And so I think it's very important for people to understand how tender it is for us to claim power in this space. Some of us may be out, some of us might be in the closet, but all of us are speaking to the need to remedy this violence.
Yeah, and let me just follow that up with, if you think about this issue of caste discrimination, based on untouchability, in nowhere in the world do Dalits have legal protection from private acts of discrimination by employers or educational institutions or in housing from this form of discrimination. The United States would be taking the lead, and California in particular, by passing this law, because there's clearly powerful legal argument that caste discrimination is already banned, but we don't have the court cases that have actually interpreted it to say that. They're in the process, but it may take a few years before they're actually decided. California doing this puts California on the cutting edge of what has to be the most significant aspect of discrimination that exists in the world. Because if you think about the number of people in the world who are Dalits, we're talking about 5% of the world's population. And that's a very significant statement to have come from the United States, and particularly from California.
I mean, thank you for being vulnerable, Thenmozhi, and explaining that. Oh, you wanted to unmute. Sorry. Here you go.
Well, and I think the other thing I would just add to what Professor Kevin was saying is that the stakes are as high as what Professor Brown is saying. For every person that speaks out about this issue, there are people in the closet that are suffering. And I mean, I know for sure I did not sign up to endure 7 months of dehumanization just because, you know. But if you think about the kinds of reports and cases that we're hearing in California, they break your heart. And the case that really defined it for me was in the city of Berkeley, where I went to undergrad. There was a landlord named Lucky Bali Reddy, who was the second largest landlord there. He trafficked over 300 workers, including, you know, 20 young girls who were minors, you know, one of whom was young as 13, and he groomed them in India when they were 8. But when he brought them here, they were his sex slaves. And they worked all of the buildings in Berkeley. If anyone was in there at that time, you remember seeing these little girls who were little shadows in the streets. Nobody asked why they weren't in school. Nobody asked why they weren't in, you know, why they were working in the middle of the day in a restaurant. They just ignored us, just like they ignore other Black and brown bodies that are being exploited. And the only way he was caught was one of the girls that was pregnant with his baby. She was 13. She died in one of his buildings, and they wrapped up her body in a rug. And then the other workers tried to take it out, and they dumped it in the street because they made a mistake. And one bystander, one ally saw this and said, "You are not taking that body anywhere. I am calling the police." And that launched this incredible investigation that exposed the extent of his exploitation of caste oppressed people, and eventually a conviction that led to some of the state's first laws around trafficking and the first convictions related to caste. But here's the thing, is that to get there, there was unending violence. The Berkeley city was threatened. The Berkeley city attorney was threatened. Interpreters were threatened. There was witness tampering where, you know, the Reddy family sent gunmen to the safe house where those girls were staying and tried to intimidate them to turn over the girls so the case would disappear. Their family homes in India, the water was cut off, acid was thrown on their thing. It was just chaos. And every time there's a caste case like this, it's just chaos for any of the complainants that come forward. So we saw that with the Cisco case, which is now in mediation. But the kind of disinformation and violence that the California Department of Civil Rights and that poor complainant has to deal with is just incredible. But, you know, we can't have more case law if we don't understand what people who come forward to bring up these issues have to endure. And it's only because of the courage of these workers that are coming forward that we even have cases. And there's another case called the Baptist Temple case, where hundreds of workers were trafficked to work for $1 an hour to build religious institutions around the country, one of which is in Chino Hills in California. They were called Worm. Their passports were confiscated. They were not even allowed to stay in proper shelter. And they were given, you know, and all sorts of kind of exploitation occurred. And now the FBI is investigating. But I just want to emphasize these are severe crimes. They're hard to prosecute because of the incredible power network of dominant caste people that do not want their crimes to be revealed. But the power that's being built here is exactly what the Progressive Caucus is really good at. We are not corporate money. We are not the people that are there to kind of continue structural power that's desecrating our communities and our earth. We are here to build people power. And the only reason we are here this far is because grassroots organizers built a movement to flank Senator Aisha Wahab and caste oppressed organizers from across the state to just be this lone light in the darkness, and to hold that light as far and as wide as it could till we could get this bill passed through. And it's really, you know, to this day, it's like the little engine that could. I don't, Professor Brown, I don't know how we did it, yeah. But we are here, you know?
Yes. Well, and let me just add to that, because now you see why it's important to actually get the law through. Look, I can give you my expertise as a law professor who's done discrimination law in the United States for literally 37 years. Who knows as much about it is virtually anyone, and especially this particular issue here, because I've spent so much time dealing with these discrimination issues as they manifest themselves in India. And I would say, yes, I have no doubt that when we get those cases in front of the U.S. federal courts, they will say that caste discrimination is covered by American anti-discrimination law. And that means a ton of protection for Dalits. But if an individual Dalit person came to me and said, Professor Brown, if I file this claim, I'm going to be subject to a tremendous amount of pressure. And my family will be subject to a tremendous amount of pressure. Can you guarantee me 100% that this will occur? And I could say no one can predict what courts do until courts actually do it. But if you write this into the legislation the way California is, then that's not an issue of prediction at all. It's 100% clear. And that will encourage people to come forward, because until they come forward and we can protect them with the law, these kinds of violations of rights will continue unabated, really, for generations.
I mean, nothing more uncomfortable than what you guys just talked about. Thank you for being so vulnerable, Thenmozhi. I think that hearing that, particularly as someone who was born and raised in the United States, like the parallels are chilling with our own history of caste oppression, and I think that that's something that people in the dominant caste here, like, you know, if we're told all of these lines about, you know, fear of discrimination against the South Asian community, or, you know, that are these talking points that come from the right wing. And I think that for those of us who are not South Asian, we can fall vulnerable to those sorts of talking points. Do you think that the majority of the opposition to 403, and particularly just the prevalence of caste discrimination, do you think that opposition and that caste discrimination is coming from people who genuinely still believe this sort of rhetoric, or do you think that that is language that is then steering folks who just don't know better?
You know, I think that what I have seen is that, you know, there's a long history of caste denial amongst dominant castes in the United States, much of which has been driven by dominant caste leaders. Like, certainly every major of the institutions who, you know, that are in opposition to it have dominant caste leadership and dominant caste boards. And it's actually a testament to the success of the caste equity movement that, you know, 20 years ago, these groups were trying to erase the word Dalit and deny that caste exists. Now these groups say, we have Dalit Bahujan leaders in our organization. You know, that's always a sign that all of a sudden they've realized, okay, you know, you can't beat them, let's join them, because they're realizing it's so stark. You know, the only people that SB 403 targets are those that discriminate. If you don't discriminate, you're not going to have an issue. That's the way protected characteristics work. You know, so, you know, the attempt, I think, from, you know, caste privileged people to keep trying to create, you know, to muddy the waters of this discussion and try to bring disinformation as if this bill would racially target or religiously target any one person or profile, it's absurd. And I think it's always important to go back to the law on this issue, because again, protected categories work all in the same way. They don't forcefully make someone to take an identity. It's only if you've been discriminated against. You then have to go to whoever's your HR, say that you've experienced this, and you have to, you know, provide the burdens of proof that someone perceived you of this background, and then investigation will then begin. But, you know, my experience is that there's a lot of fragility and a lot of fear about what changes whenever civil rights occurs, because people who have been in positions of privilege view equity as oppression. But I think that you deal with the feelings and the fear and the fragility with other containers than stopping the progress of civil rights. We actually have formal obligations under civil, racial, and labor rights law to ensure that all Californian institutions remain accessible to all. And the priority must really stay focused on the discriminated that are asking and demanding for a remedy, because just one case of discrimination is wrong and unlawful. And for those that are feeling afraid and fragile, we have containers for that. There are group workshops. We can have sessions on reconciliation and healing. You can work with other dominant caste people who are working to unlearn their privilege. But that fear and fragility, is not the measure for which we're looking at in terms of our obligations to ensuring the implementation of the rule of law for everyone.
Yeah, and let me jump in here too, especially on the issue of caste deniers. I've spent a considerable amount of time in India going back and forth, talking about my research, talking about the treatment that Dalits receive in India, and both in the urban area and in the rural area. Now, I will say, in the urban areas of India, there's a certain amount of anonymity that one may be able to hide a person's caste. That doesn't exist in the rural areas. The rural areas, caste discrimination is going to be rampant. But the ability, and I've actually been astonished at the deniers of caste discrimination, because to me it's so obvious. And I'll give you an example of a student I had who was an upper caste student. She actually was born here in the U.S. So I talk about the discrimination Dalits experience in one of my classes. And afterwards, she stood up in class. She said, "Professor Brown is wrong. We don't discriminate against Dalits anymore. That used to be the case. We're all over that now." And then she said, "But of course, you wouldn't invite them to a religious ceremony. And you wouldn't invite them to your home, and you wouldn't want someone to marry a Dalit." I'm like, look, this is the kind of denial that they face. And most of the people that the South Asians that I know here in the United States, they are intelligent people. They are easy to get along with. They're very knowledgeable. They're very friendly. And you raise this issue of caste discrimination with them, and they will say, no, that doesn't exist. That it's not like it used to be in the past, and we're pretty much over it. And they too are denying it, even as they practice it here. And I've dealt with high caste Hindus here who, as they deny caste discrimination, they practice it. So and I don't know if the denial is something that they're doing consciously or if they're doing it subconsciously. But the deniers are there in huge numbers. And then if you think about what they're arguing when they say, look, this will target the South Asian community, what they're asking for is a legal right to discriminate. And we don't grant the legal rights to discriminate. If you look at the most recent Supreme Court case, that is exactly what the Supreme Court said. There is no legal right to discriminate. So the argument to me is really a fallacious argument that is intended to shield this particular community from the charges of discrimination that are rampant within that community.
We've seen how this, people talk about white fragility in the chat, and I know there are some people that will find that triggering. This is a big part of the reason why I want to do this and have white people part of this conversation, because ultimately it's going to be up to us and other caste dominant folks to lead this conversation. It should not be up to the oppressed to advocate for their own civil rights, even though that's always what happens. We've seen this pushback in the face of equity in the United States result in the rise of what can only be described as right-wing fascism. What does that look like in South Asian countries? And what are some of our politicians, what is the Biden administration, what is Congress missing when they are trying to engage in good faith diplomacy with these governments that are having a parallel, if there is that parallel rise? What are they missing, and how can we be like, look, we just did it here, not good?
I'll give you a chance to think about it, and I'll just touch on a couple of brief issues. But the one thing that Americans don't really understand, right, is the concept of us criticizing other countries for human rights abuses is a relatively recent concept. We didn't have any problem at all dealing with South Africa when it was minority rule, dealing with oppressive regimes like the Batista regime or the regimes in South Latin America, because we were fighting the Cold War. So we didn't want to let our human rights concerns get in the way of fighting the Cold War. America has been more concerned about human rights records of other countries since the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. But it still seems to me that much of international politics is driven primarily by interest. And I think there is a real concern at the national level about China, with a desire that India be an ally in that struggle. That being the case, it does seem to me that the American government is more circumspect with respect to critiquing some of the human rights abuses that are going on in India today. But once again, that's because quite often in the international community, the way things play out for us as America is what's in our best interest. And I'll let Maurer talk about how things are changing for Dalits in India.
Well, I think that what we are seeing is a rise of global right-wing movements everywhere, and they are coordinated, they're collaborative, and they are determined to overturn democratic processes to enable ethno-fascism, and in some cases religious ethno-fascism, wherever. So when you're thinking about Abe in Japan, Orban in Hungary, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Modi in India, Trump in the United States, these are not accidental moments. Like, it's not like, oops, a country tripped and then they fell into fascism. This was invested in, this was built in, and it was, fostered by American corporations and social media companies that basically disrupted democracies all around the world, enabling these like vicious anti-democratic processes everywhere. And I think what's also very critical is you have figures like Steve Bannon, who was one of the people that knitted relationships. He, just because he disappeared for a moment out of American view didn't mean he disappeared from the global stage. And he very intentionally set up meetings between right-wing movements to make sure everyone was connected. And in fact, in the United States, Bannon is the vice chair of the Republican Coalition of Hindus for Trump, the RHC. So when you think about that, there's no reason for him to be part of a coalition of Hindus voting for Trump, except for the ideological nature of these leaders and the kinds of virulent religious ethno-fascism. That's why in Houston, you had Howdy Modi that had Donald Trump with, Modi. And in fact, when Trump first ran, the only immigrant group that held a rally for him were, Hindus in New Jersey, and they held like a whole thing. And that was like, there's a whole, campaign that was part of moving South Asian communities for Trump. So I bring that up because I want to just kind of focus on what you brought up earlier in that question, Emma, is that there are anti-democratic forces. Like anytime there is a group that is opposed to civil rights, that should be a red alarm that we are seeing a right-wing group mobilizing, trying to stop the flow of democratic processes. And the same people that oppose SB 403, I want to be very clear, they are the same people who are opposed to affirmative action. In fact, many of these organizations celebrated the Supreme Court attack on affirmative action. They also, like Professor Brown, and again, Professor Brown is one of the luminaries of the critical race theory framework, and has been doing that work alongside his work around affirmative action. It's why it's like so disgusting when you see these groups also targeting critical race theory, and they also target caste oppressed organizations saying, look, you don't like critical race theory, look, these folks are the wokeness group, they're bringing critical caste theory. And then they denigrate queer organizations and leaders as well. I mean, it's like this trifecta of right-wing nonsense. And in some ways, someone like Vivek Ramaswamy represents the worst instincts of the right wing from the South Asian community. But I would argue that you can have that strand of politics, but you also have the progressive possibility that is, really representative of the caste equity movement, where you have for the first time a very powerful intercaste, interfaith, multiracial, labor-driven, queer-led, feminist-driven movement across the state of South Asians and allies who have done the impossible. If any, Professor Brown knows, having worked in this work, no one would have ever thought that we could have brought the fifth largest economy in the world, one of the most populous states in the country, to have become a global leader in civil rights around caste. But that's what the power of unity really can do. So I think, we can sometimes feel afraid about the power of the right wing, but actually we are much more stronger because there's more of us. But I think that we're afraid often to take that first step of courage to join hands with another movement to really take and grasp the ring of power collectively. But I just want to say this little engine that is the caste equity movement, it's really a model of what we can do when we take on harder battles, like the environmental justice battles that we have. Like, I was really, touched by the work of Fatima and so many of the Progressive Caucus members at Visalia who were fighting for all those incredible environmental bills, all of which didn't get the endorsement, as Hurricane Hillary was hitting Southern California. I mean, the irony of that just shows the kinds of tensions we have as a democracy, but it's really our responsibility to bring unity, to bring vision, to bring hope in a time of darkness, and hopefully we can do that together.
So I think we're closing in on, do you think we covered most of the things? I know that yes, we're going to do direct questions from the audience. What, if you had a wish list, you can ask, what would you want from people who look like me? What would you want from people who are caste privileged? Not what should we do, but what do you want from us and what do you need from us to make this battle finally a successful one in all areas of, globally, not just in California, not just nationally, but in finally tackling these human rights issues globally?
I would just for myself, because this is clearly something that Maurer should answer better than I. But I would want you to call your Democrats, call your legislator in California and pass this bill. I just cannot begin to tell you how substantial the global implications are of California passing this bill. This will be a huge statement in the international community.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Professor Brown. I mean, I just want every little girl and every little boy and every child that doesn't quite know their gender yet to be able to say, I live in a state where every person can be free from caste. And that matters because there are so many children that are encasted that don't feel like they can be their full selves. And we do win. I see your quote there, Fatima. We win when we stand in solidarity, but when we know that we can extend the promise of California opportunity to all oppressed peoples, we have made a statement that will resound for the ages. And our ancestors are watching us to make sure that we break these generational curses and we stand strong. And the one thing I think allies, Emma, can do is, I think that for what we've seen in the conversation with SB 403 is a lot of legislative people, outside of needing more information about the legality, I think most people understand their notions of discrimination in a very kind of, a very simple way where it's like, oh, there are white folks who discriminate against everyone else. So it's racism in a very American framework. But what this edition of Caste does is it not only globalizes our understanding of systems of discrimination, but it's also awakening us to that California is in fact a globalized community. We have many countries of origin, many systems of discrimination, and we need to evolve how we're understanding how does oppression work. And I think that I saw a lot of people understand, coming to us from offices saying like, well, I'm so confused. Why would South Asians be against a bill that would protect them from discrimination? And I said, because not all oppressors are white, and that whole tension that we're exposing means that all of us have to be allies to struggles everywhere. And so I think you can make a difference by calling if you are a delegate and you have a certain assembly person in your district on your cell phone, text them and let them know, hey, let me kind of clarify this issue. It's actually very simple. Discrimination has no place in California. Vote yes on this bill. That's it. And I have 2 links for folks. I'm going to send people a link where you can send an email to all of the offices, and another link where you can put your name and pass it so we get, signatures to Governor Newsom. What allies can do is clarify who is in fact the aggrieved party here, and also what the outcome of this bill is. This bill, basically empowers all of us to ensure all Californian institutions are free from discrimination, period. There is no targeting of any group, only those that discriminate. And what Professor Brown said is very important. The people who are against this bill are fighting for the right to continue to discriminate. And we don't want that. So to stand with us now is to really ensure that we make history, not just for California, not just for the nation, but for the world.
I think that I told Fatima, I'm like, I could go on and on for hours. I think that obviously priority number 1 is getting this bill passed. Let's get this bill passed. We can say that now because we endorsed it last weekend. So like, hip, hip, hooray, let's get this thing passed. And then I do think that, the next part of this conversation, which, when we didn't know whether or not the bill was going to be endorsed, a larger part of this conversation was going to be, how are we now evolving into the formation of new caste systems in the United States with the attacks on the LGBTQ community and the trans community? And how is that similar? How did Nazi Germany borrow from our anti-Black and non-miscegenation laws in the U.S. for formation of the Third Reich? So I think that, we want to we're going to have a panel on reparations. I think it would be cool to combine reparations and criminal justice, because I think the two are inextricably linked, and would love it, Dr. Brown, if you would be willing to participate in that, and Thenmozhi, if you would like to participate in that, especially, on the heels of when we get 403 passed, how that can be a model for, moving for a social movement, not just a legislative legal movement, but a social movement against all forms of discrimination here and abroad. So I know that we have some questions from the audience, and if you guys have any remarks that you want to say that I missed, free for all.
I just quickly say, count me in for the next panel too.
Fatima, do you want to read questions so far? And
Yeah,
then,
I can. Sure, Emma. Emma, first of all, give claps to Emma for doing such a great job. Emma, that was such an informative panel. Thank you for organizing it and putting together the great set of questions that you put together. And yes, we have some audience questions, and what we can do is do some raised hands questions too if folks have those. I'm just making sure I got everyone. Okay. Yeah, okay. So about 5 or 6 questions. So we'll see if you have time for all of them. I actually want to start with this one because I think it's very relevant to us as a progressive caucus, right? You both talked a lot about the right wing and fascism, and you know how some of the folks that are anti-403 are sort of allied with Trump, right? A good point was brought up, and I think it was by Juan in the audience that said, you know, this might be a tough question, right? Because folks want to tiptoe on these issues. But the question was, this is a problem on both sides of the aisle, right? Not just in the Republican Party, right? Not just the labeled right wing. We have some Democrats that may fall into the same category, right? And, you know, Juan was saying that this should be clarified or else it'll become a partisan conversation missing the entire framework. And I think that's a great point. And you know, you both are more well versed to talk about the history of this and both parties, where we were then, where we are now. And it's a difficult conversation, right? Because our caucus is under the Democratic Party, but I think it's a needed conversation. So I want, you know, one or both of you to address that as, yes, we're seeing folks that are identifying as Republican, you know, against, you know, with this bill against addressing this issue, but what are some of the problematic components in our own party, right? In the Democratic Party that we are seeing and we want to shift. And yeah, I hope I'm asking a question and it makes sense, but.
Well, I'll keep my remarks fairly short on that because I try not to get too involved in politics other than telling people they should vote, because that's really how things get changed. Certainly, our democratic system here has problems in that people are now beginning to take their political ideology as the core of their own individual being. Right? It didn't used to be. It used to be I am me who is a Republican, or I am me who is a Democrat. And that's like I'm a Democrat. The Democrat or the Republican becomes part of your identity, and that makes it very hard to communicate with people who are on the other side, because you don't just see them as people who have different arguments. You see them as the enemy to be opposed. And that is a problem in our legal system. I'm sorry, in our political system. But our political system does have problems. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, one of the hallmarks of democracies that are in trouble is like polarization that gets to the point where you can no longer have consensus. And I think it's very difficult to build consensus when you have, you know, people who don't even see the other side as human. And, you know, and I think about some of the stuff that was raised around this bill, where there was like a lot of arguments, you know, about
Oh, the Thenmozhi freeze?
Thenmozhi froze.
Yeah, she may.
Oh no!
Let me
negotiate your humiliation.
Thenmozhi, can you go back about like 30 seconds because you froze and we missed.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I've learned about this process is that California politics, you know, has this principle that you build laws through consensus with all stakeholders, right? But that presumes that you have all stakeholders that are at the same level at the table. And I think that the thing I was really challenged by is that the opponents to this bill, you know, presume the dehumanization of our people as a given. So, you know, to negotiate your humanity is very difficult, you know, and I think that we have to really be able to give people the strength to take the moral courage around issues that are necessary. Sometimes you cannot create compromise because we are compromising our very earth, or we're compromising our very humanity, you know, or we're compromising the fate of our children. And I think that's really where we have to be able to give encouragement all along our political spectrum to be able to have people make choices of moral courage versus, polarizing ideology. And I bring this up, that, the thing I think that's interesting about this bill, because I was talking about this with Amar, was that he's like, this bill is like weirdly a unicorn, because there's rarely things that are bipartisan anymore. And yet this bill, has bipartisan support, and you have so many different actors across the political spectrum in California and federal government that support this bill, including the American Bar Association. To have the American Bar Association, the South Asian Bar Association, the National Association of Asian American Pacific Islander Bar Association, and many, many, many other legal entities, and the ACLU, and you do not get legal consensus like that on many issues. But I think we did a great job organizing, and folks from the Caste Equity Legal Task Force did an amazing job, making this case of legality across the country. It's a really good example of how we can stop getting stuck into these polarized divides and really be able to get to work on our shared humanity. And I know that's not easy, because there's a lot of things that still break us apart, but we've got to figure out ways to build that consensus, because, we're failing our children when we're not able to break through that gridlock,
Thank you. All right. Yes, I'll read the next question. So from Margaret, so it's a long question. So I'll do my best here. How does the caste system relate to people of religions besides Hindu in India, such as Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, etc.? And Margaret wrote, because I got my church to take a stand in support of SB 403, but one of the Indian immigrants who is in our own church board said it wasn't true that Christians and Muslims were generally considered low caste within the Indian caste system. So I had to cut out a reference to that in the letter that I drafted for the board to sign off on. He's from Kerala. Also, I have noted that some Sikhs are in support, others are opposed. I'm trying to understand better what's going on with that. And I'll paste the question again in the chat, because I know that was long.
Thank you for that. And I also just want to shout out Margaret and also Alfred, who have been like incredible supporters of SB 403. And Margaret has been tireless in her advocacy in our district. So, if people want to know who have been real allies in the caucus, like, you should definitely give those people a hug the next time you see them. But, that said, I think one of the ways to look at this is that, so a really funny thing has happened with this bill is that because people don't know where to go to for experts around this, they basically ask the random people they know in their life. So they're like, oh, I have an Indian dentist, I asked them. Or, oh, I went to my restaurant that I go to and I asked them. And certainly people can inform with lived experience, but it's really important in the context of caste, go to experts. Go to places like the Stanford Center of South Asian Studies, where I'm a fellow, or UC Berkeley or UC Santa Cruz have very strong South Asian studies departments. And there are South Asian professors who are experts around caste and the diaspora across the Cal State system. And the reason why I'm saying go to experts or go to lawyers like Professor Brown or Tarina Mand from the South Asian Bar Association, who is the head of their Civil Rights Task Force and is based in San Diego. Or Navdeep Singh, who's from Napaba, is because there's a lot of misinformed laypersons' opinions on these issues, and they are misinformed in part because of the violence that's associated with actually speaking factually about caste. So, it is actually not accurate what that person said, is that, first of all, across South Asia, caste is found in all communities of religious practice, so it is found amongst Hindu communities, around Sikh communities, Buddhist communities, Jain communities, Muslim communities. It looks different. And, and it has very kind of particular experiences of it. But you can have, like, for example, a community like the Christian community, where you can have upper caste Christians who are discriminating against lower caste Christians. And you can also have the people of the entirety of the South Asian Christian faith face both religious and caste persecution, and even untouchability in some case from other members of other faiths. So when that person said that they were from Kerala and they said that's not true, there is actually a strand of Christianity in Kerala called the Syrian Christians, which, you know, was made up of people who were dominant caste who converted to that Christian faith. They actually discriminated against lower caste people and in fact held slaves. And, you know, when the British abolished slavery, Syrian Christians actually fought to retain the ability to have slaves long into, you know, the early 1900s. So many Syrian Christians don't know their own history of that context, but it's actually very well documented by many caste oppressed scholars through, you know, colonial writings and, you know, testimonies of caste Christians. But it is also true that people in the majority of Christian and Muslim and Sikh faiths were converts from caste oppressed communities. Not all of them were Dalit, but many of them were caste oppressed. And in those communities of practice, they then still reinstated specific practices of untouchability for people that converted that were explicitly from Dalit caste. That's why in the Sikh tradition, you still have the Ravadasya community, you know, and so on and so forth. And so I think it's just very important to know that religion is one way that intersects with caste, but because there are so many different myriad of experiences of how faith intersects with it, you want to think of it like an intersectional issue where it's like caste is really its own standalone category. It's discrimination based on work, birth, and descent. Anyone that experiences can speak about their own specific context, but we should never say that it's only in one faith or that it's not in this one faith, because it's actually such a globally bound experience, and there's very specific practices of untouchability with each of these religious communities in South Asia. And that's not even talking about the way faith might operate with other global systems of caste like that in Japan and Korea, the Roma people, and the African tribes that practice it in the continent of Africa, you know.
Yeah, let me just say a couple of quick points about the Christian community in South Asia, because obviously Christianity is not native to South Asia, so it had to come from Christian missionaries who came there, and for the most part they were British. There were few. Certainly Kerala was one of the places where the Portuguese Christianity would have spread, but most of this was British. And if you think about our British cousins, right, our British cousins have royalty. They have kings and queens. They have the dukes. They have the barons. They have much more of a type of caste system that we always rejected here in the U.S. So us in the U.S., we always believed more in individualism. Now, obviously, the more modern times, the more we believed in individualism. But those Christian missionaries, as they go to India to look for converts, realize quickly they have to make a choice. If they're going to convert the upper caste, they're going to have to accept the caste system, or else they're not going to be able to convert the upper caste. If they don't accept the caste system, then they're only going to be trying to convert low caste and Dalits. And those Christian organizations tended to take the belief that if we can convert the elites will bring other people with them. So even from the very beginning, they were accepting caste as a necessary evil, if you will, to their ability to convert large numbers of people on the continent.
And one last thought about that, just for like the people that really want to nerd out on this, is that what Professor Brown also is speaking to is that different missionaries from different denominations had different practices related to how they wanted to continue or block the caste system. So people that were Jesuits, they felt like we shouldn't disrupt the caste hierarchy, so they maintained the caste hierarchy. So there was Catholic churches that had Dalits sitting on the floor and upper castes on the pews. And so they were not allowed to, then they maintained it. And Dalit Catholics, you know, one of their biggest asks has been, we want more representation than church. We want to desegregate our cemeteries, because even the cemeteries are segregated. Dalits being in one part because their bodies in death can't be mingled with the upper caste in life. I mean, that's absurd, right? But you also have other denominations where, like the Presbyterian and the Episcopalians, who were like, no, you know, Jesus was someone who believed in the freedom of the oppressed, and they then decided they were going to only administer to the caste oppressed. So in the state of Punjab, for example, one caste of untouchables, you know, that was called the Chura caste, they were manual scavengers, they became the primary converts. And in fact, they all took on the last name Masih, M-A-S-I-H, which was like a derivation of Messiah, in order to escape. And it was like a determined part of their mission work. So, you know, it's this history is really important, because again, people became Christian. When they became Christian, they no longer were eligible for affirmative action back in their home countries. And a lot of the ways dominant caste people try to denigrate caste oppressed Christians' experiences of religious persecution in India and here is they'll call you a rice bag, you know, or a sepoy, which means like a betrayer. So I learned about this because people know that my mom was Christian. You know, both my parents were raised Hindu and Christian, and my dad was Hindu when I was growing up. My mom was Christian. But I was like, what's a rice bag? You know, why am I being called a rice bag? And it's because they're saying that we are people with such little dignity that we converted because we were hungry. We converted for rice versus like a choice of religious conviction. And it's so demeaning, it's so degrading. And many of the Christians that did advocacy on this issue, you would see in the social media posts attacking our coalition, they would call us rice bags or dirty Christians or whatever. So it's the religious freedom component of also being able to fight for SB 403 is caste oppressed people literally just want to be like other Californians. We can go to work without discrimination, live in our houses without discrimination, and we just want to be able to practice and get opportunity like everyone else, you know, and without being tormented or tortured or being, you know, facing like paralyzing disinformation. We just want to live our lives, you know, and be free like other people.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a couple more questions from the audience, and then, you know, Emma, we could maybe close at 6, or if you want to take more like raise times questions, you could as well. Okay, so this was actually a question I had. Audience questions. This was the audience. Okay, another difficult one. So, you know, I actually learned this later. You know, Dr. Brown, you talked about Gandhi and the freedom fighters, but the history I hear about Gandhi is, you know, some people call him directly a racist or say that there were issues he had with finding complete solidarity. Again, another difficult thing to talk about, but I think it's important. You know, I'm from the AAPI community, and I want to recognize, right, the anti-Blackness that still exists, right, even to this day in some parts of the AAPI community and with different individuals and you know, communities and things. So can we address that maybe difficult topic that folks have heard that, you know, people say Gandhi was a racist, and you mentioned him in being solidarity, but I've heard some other things. I want to hear more on that.
Sure. You know, as you can imagine, as an African American, a lot of my Dalit friends ask, why do African Americans embrace Gandhi? Didn't they know he was a racist? How can this be? And I think to a certain, I think what that represents is an understanding of the African American community and Gandhi from a South Asian perspective, not from the perspective of the Black community. From the perspective of the Black community, what starts to happen with our community in the early part of the 20th century? So this is right about the time Indian freedom fighters are beginning to coalesce and beginning to come together with their struggle. But what starts to happen with us is the beginnings of internationalizing our struggle. We are now, if you look at voluntary immigration of Black people into the U.S., The first major group of voluntary immigrants were the West Indians that came at the early part of the 20th century. And one of the big figures there was Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was Jamaican, which means he was a citizen of the United Kingdom, a subject of the United Kingdom, as were Indians. So he's very global in his outlook. So for us then, as I said before, we began to look at the Indian freedom fighters as allies in a global struggle against white supremacy. So we come into understanding and contact with Gandhi as part of that. Now, the person who actually
hello.
Okay.
Sorry, that was a Zoom bar. I'm so sorry, Dr. Brown, for that.
No problem. The person who precedes Gandhi is Lajpat Rai. And Lajpat Rai, more than anyone, connected the Black community up to the Indian freedom fighters. He was good friends with Booker T. Washington. He was good friends with W.E.B. Du Bois, very good friends with W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the major figure in globalizing the African American struggle. So when we saw Gandhi, and you're right, there's no question, in South Africa, Gandhi was very much a racist. But by the time we start to come together and learn about Gandhi, is in the late 1920s and early 1930s, and especially the early 1930s. I should say, I've actually written a chapter of this in a book called Ambedkar in London, because I wanted to put out why was the Black community embraced Gandhi. So you go back to the 1930s. Now, Gandhi is against untouchability. He's not against the caste system, but he's against untouchability. And whether or not you can actually eliminate untouchability without disestablishing the caste system, I think we can debate. But for the African American community, Gandhi's like this white person who's saying to other white people, you need to stop oppressing Black people. So Gandhi had a very positive reputation within the Black community. And by the time we get to 1933 is really the big year, where 5 of the major pre-Black civil rights leaders head to India to meet with Gandhi and to talk to him. And they come back singing his praises. And these were the people who would then become the teachers of Martin Luther King Jr., Jesse Jackson, the entire civil rights leadership that came out of the South. So we saw Gandhi as someone who was against untouchability. And once you keep in mind, African Americans didn't understand all of the intricacies of the caste system. They do understand the hierarchy. And that's why there was always the concern about, well, where do you stand with respect to untouchability? Are you against untouchability? Which Gandhi was. Lajpat Rai also was against it. So we saw him primarily in the context of a global struggle against white supremacy. And in that struggle, then you get a switch. And now the people who are the allies for African Americans aren't the caste oppressed people, but they would be all South Asians.
And I think, Fatima, I dropped a link to an article that I wrote, because I think the way to think about this is like Schrodinger's cat. There are many truths here from different specific contexts to kind of really observe. And, especially because, at the core of, Black perspectives on Gandhi is really understanding the US context in which people are really trying to understand, is race analogous to colony? or is race analogous to caste? And I think that because dominant caste people were the first people to engage with all of these different Black civil rights movement leaders, you know, race as colony is part of the shaping of what allowed Gandhi to be a figure that would represent the Indian freedom struggle, and also Gandhi's interpretation of who are the stakeholders in that he could speak on behalf of caste oppressed people and also gatekeep from allowing leaders like Dr. Ambedkar, who was actually more analogous to those leaders, to have a formal relationship with Gandhi directly. He gatekeeps so that the race as colony versus race as caste analogy could really be built in a profound way. And, you know, language barriers are a huge part of it. Economic and political access are a huge part of it. And dominant caste people have always tried to gatekeep the history of the subcontinent in that way to other oppressed peoples, because it's much easier for them to be racialized than to acknowledge their own ways that they have dominated people in turn. But I think specifically with Gandhi, there was a very big global movement, and it started, you know, there's certainly been caste oppressed people that have been calling out, you know, Gandhi's, you know, kind of abysmal record on race and caste for many years. But I think it really became a global conversation when this university in Ghana asked for the removal of a Gandhi statue. And they said Gandhi must fall. And it happened in the context of the decolonizing movement that also was looking at Cecil Rhodes and his, you know, blueprint for apartheid, and how that was kind of connected with a larger cry to decolonize, you know, universities everywhere. And, you know, I think the unsavory part of Gandhi is that, yes, he was extremely racist in his time in South Africa. He had very disgusting, you know, opinions of, you know, Native African Zulu peoples and indigenous tribes. And he would also link them to his own anti-indigeneity of South Asian peoples. And what Professor Brown spoke about is that he was ideally a caste reformist, but not a caste abolitionist, meaning that he was like, untouchability is bad, but there is value to the caste system. And in fact, he had these very saccharine notions that people who were manual scavengers, people who picked up, you know, the shit of other communities, instead of saying that was wrong, he's like, well, maybe these people could become the magical sanitation engineers of society. And he was just wanting people to lean into their caste occupations versus saying this is absurd and whatever. But the reason why Gandhi's reformist politics eventually had to get pushed was because of the sheer pressure of the caste abolition movement and leaders like Dr. Ambedkar, who pushed his reformist ideas into more radical ideas of freedom. And I really encourage people to read about Dr. Ambedkar, because he really is that liberatory figure that could have been a connector of so many oppressed movements. But unfortunately, the politics of the time did not allow that. And the only other issue I would mention with Gandhi is that he was a sexual predator. And he had this like really weird process where he would want to test his purity by sleeping naked with young girls. And there was a lot of people that were very uncomfortable with his kind of ideas about that were, you know, that have, and I included that in the article. So, you know, what does it mean? All of our historical figures have clay feet. And, you know, I think understanding the historical pieces of why certain movements found, you know, particular, you know, ideas and leaders useful is, I think, important. And then also knowing the debates that structure them are also important. And, you know, I think that for caste oppressed people, we cannot, you know, his position around caste was so debilitating for us, and we lost rights because of it. So we have a particular tension with with Gandhi, but I can certainly appreciate the way that the notion of Gandhi, maybe not Gandhi himself, but the notion of Gandhi was a very critical catalyst to the tactics of the civil rights movement in the South, especially when people were trying to figure out how do we visually depict a movement that is nonviolent in the context of deep, abiding violence in the South. And so I think we can appreciate that contribution while also understanding this was a flawed figure who actually, you know, caused problems for other people, and call it a day, you know.
Apologies from Fatima. I have just gotten word that her computer spontaneously restarted itself. she had a couple more questions from the chat that were yes or no questions. But while she's come back, I had a follow-up question just with something that you spoke about, because it was one that I was originally intending to ask. Then we just sort of followed the direction. For those of us who don't know, who was Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar, and what did he do, and how did he meet MLK, and all of that stuff?
Well,
go ahead, Professor Brown. You take this.
Yeah, this, I have thought about writing a book on him and comparing him with African American leaders. I have to say, I have studied so many extraordinary people throughout history. And quite frankly, I have not come to anyone who is as extraordinary as Dr. Ambedkar, who was able to think clearly about this issue of untouchability at a point in time when no one else was. And the theories that he was putting together, so let me just, and of course, I definitely want to hear how Thenmozhi would describe him, but this is the way I would describe him. Because Ambedkar was the first Dalit to come to the United States and get a PhD. So he got a PhD from London. He studied under John Dewey, who was one of the great educational reformers of U.S. history. He's also going to get a PhD from London School of Economics, and be called to the bar in London. So he becomes a barrister. He will go on then to, one, write the Indian, or be the chairperson of the drafting committee of the Indian Constitution. So in this way, he's sort of like the #1 lawyer for Dalits. So in that capacity, he's sort of like Thurgood Marshall when I'm talking about the African American community. He's going to start the first political party for Dalits. And in that sense, I sort of see him as Jesse Jackson and Jesse Jackson's run for the presidency. He's going to be their main mass leader of Dalit movement, Dalit protest. He's going to do these incredible protest movement where he will burn the sacred Hindu literature in a protest against untouchability and how Hindu religion is hooked up in it. So as a mass protest leader, I think of him in the way I would think about Martin Luther King Jr. In addition to that, he's going to create a different version of Buddhism for the Dalit community, one that is coming out of their experiences. And in that way, he seems to me to be like Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. And I'm not even talking about the fact that his PhD was in economics, and he did literally groundbreaking work in economic theory. I mean, this is a man who is probably the most under-recognized great person in world history, but that's me, and I'm not even Dalit.
Yeah, I mean, Professor Brown, I mean, you said it. I mean, I think that the thing for people to know is that, in many ways, Dr. Ambedkar was like a stem cell, like those cells that before we differentiate, you need someone that has all of the vision and all of the sector's caste impacts. So he was all of these things. I also think of him as like Thomas Jefferson, Professor Brown, because he was the architect of the Indian Constitution.
Yes.
So he was a movement leader, he was a jurist, he was also an economist, and he built the Reserve Bank of India, right? But in all of these things that he was the first in, part of what he had to do, and the reason why he took that massive role, is because caste is such a multidimensional problem that operates at the sphere of the law, that sphere of the political and the economical, but also the spiritual and also the geographical, because it's an apartheid, right? He led these incredible marches to desegregate water tanks because we weren't allowed to drink from collective water, to desegregate roads because we weren't allowed to walk on the same roads as other people, to fight against atrocity. And I kind of see, like, in all of the different spheres of his life, he was trying everything he could to eliminate the evil that was untouchability. So he is very inspirational. And we worked with Representative Ro Khanna on the first resolution to celebrate his life and his birthday during Dalit History Month, April 14th. And this is certainly a holiday that the Progressive Caucus could celebrate, you know, every April. But I think that what's so profound is that, you know, all of us who are fighting for SB 403, we view ourselves as children of Ambedkar. You know, in some small ways, he opened up this massive legacy for us to be free. And so in whatever ways, big and small, we are working towards contributing to the end of caste apartheid. And in some ways, SB 403 is a legacy also of Ambedkar, because again, he was one of the first Dalit Americans. He studied at Columbia and was at Columbia during the Harlem Renaissance. And when he was there, he was struck by, well, here's, you know, because think about it, India had not become free yet, right? So he's like, I'm in a former colony of the British, and look at what America failed. At that time, even though America was a democracy, Black people and women did not have the right to vote. And he said, I will not allow that to happen for my oppressed peoples. So he created innovative law to ensure the protection of women's rights and oppressed peoples that became a blueprint. Like, his constitution was a blueprint for South Asian democracies all across the region. So Ambedkar definitely needs to be on your altar of freedom. And I think that, you know, again, the history of SB 403 is not just the history of a small community in California. It's Asian American history, it's civil rights history, and it's a legacy that people will talk about for the ages.
But Emma, let me just to jump in, because we are talking about Ambedkar, and you mentioned my personal connection to the Dalit struggle. It comes right here. On October 14th, 1956, Dr. Ambedkar is going to lead a conversion of $600,000 to this version of Buddhism that he's created. That was the very day I was born. So as this event is occurring in India, right, I am coming into the world, and that's always made me think maybe I was just destined to be here working on this issue.
I don't know who Gregor Healy is, but I don't want to let them in because I'm worried about the last time.
Okay.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any other questions before we don't admit Greg? I'm sorry if anyone knows Gregor Keeley. Tell them I'm sorry. Oh, okay. They can come in. I'm traumatized from the last unknown. Greg, it's not a Zoom bummer. Anybody else have any other questions? Any closing remarks that we would like to make?
Yeah, sure. I'll make mine really short. Jabin, and let's get this thing passed. Let's make history.
Yes, I just echo that. And I want to also echo my thanks for the Progressive Caucus, because again, we, you know, the wild thing about this bill is there wasn't a single Dalit leader in the state that had ever talked to their legislative leader. You know, we had never been to Sacramento, and we didn't know how to even get a bill passed. That is how wild this was. That's also why when Senator Aisha Wahab reached out and she's like, do you want to work on a bill? I was like, sure. And then I got off the phone and I was like, I have no idea how to do that. And, you know, it was so funny. It was leaders in the Progressive Caucus that actually helped us learn about the process. So I just remember these late night calls with Amar, who kind of explained to me how things worked, or, you know, Margaret, who helped me really think about like what's happening at the party caucus level. Because, you know, one of the things our opponents tried to do is to try to stop the endorsement of the bill at the county party level. So all of a sudden we had to organize in a process that we had no idea, give testimonies to people we had never interacted with. And, you know, because caste oppressed peoples are so terrified about coming out, you know, our opponents may have had more relationships with delegates or the local party apparatus, but we had none. We literally did not know anybody, did not engage. And then I also think about partners on the C3 side, like the Tech Equity Collaborative, who really walked us through what does advocacy look like. Here's how you do drop-in visits. Here's how you start to track, you know, it sounds really basic because maybe you guys are like all experts. We literally had no knowledge. And then we had to like spin up, you know, base building relationships across all these, you know, all of these different communities across the state. And there was such a welcoming presence that the caucus gave us. Like when we went to the California Democratic Convention in Los Angeles, we had no idea what to do. We had no idea where we were going, but we brought 75 to 80 people. And we came up and we voted for the first time. We got to see so many people were excited to understand that you could engage at the party level. And, you know, I know that there's like the Jedi Initiative, but the process of working on the bill actually was our diversity engagement with the party. And that couldn't have happened without the caucus folks who welcomed us. And it was just really incredible. And so my hope is that, yes, we make history and we pass it, but we continue to make history by strong statewide networks that support progressive issues across all of our platforms, and that caste oppressed people are a core part of it, because we're hungry now. You know, we have the taste of victory. We have the taste of what it means to be engaged. And we want to be part of conversations about climate change and racial justice and reproductive freedom, because again, all of our struggles are linked. And so we just couldn't have gotten there. You know, I think a lot of people, you know, may not know how much volunteer work goes into a space like this. But if people hadn't taken time after their work, time they could have spent with their families to educate, you know, Dalit Californians on this issue, we would not have gotten this far. And, you know, I want to thank Karen also, who has been incredible in helping us understand the process, because again, this is a really complicated process to do legislative work that's really for the privileged. You know, you have to take time off, you're going to Sacramento. Think about how many people have the ability to go to Sacramento in the middle of a workday. And then to, like, you know, to engage with your members and to be able to talk in the place of the law. So we just couldn't have done it without so many people here. And I'm so, so grateful. And hopefully we're of what can happen when you keep platforming the most grassroots, vulnerable communities. Our power, you know, all over grows. So just thank you, everybody, and thank you for the ability to discuss this with you all. It was really an honor. And I want to give special shouts out to all of the Dalit leaders that are on this call, you know, Ramesh Suman, Sunita, you know, Sandeep Chavin, Romeo, you know, anyone else that I missed, I'm sorry, but, you know, this really matters because, again, this is the first time they're coming out and we're coming out in force. So thank you.
Thank you both. Political advocacy is such a place of privilege. And I met you at convention and the tensions were so high and you were like, I have 10 people. We signed up, but we didn't get ballots yet. And I was all paranoid about the establishment packing. And you were like, I saw I think it was your dad's SB 403 sign. And I was like, oh, come with me. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is actually happening. And then when I went, I turned in, we were doing voter registration right there. And I had a stack of voter registration cards and all the South Asian names on these voter registration cards. I was like, my heart is breaking because these people had not yet been able to participate in this process, but also like turning those registration forms in and being like, this is what it looks like when we work together and when we uplift these issues that like don't get into these spaces. So just thank you so much. And I really excited. We're all really excited to just keep busting down all of these doors with you both. And go 403. I'm ready to go make calls now. Not that, actually, I wonder, my assembly member is a Republican, but maybe she'll listen.
You know what? We need those Republicans. We want to get as high of a vote as possible. Call.
I will call.
Yes, call them. And again, that one email link emails all of the offices. And then that petition for Newsom really matters. But we want to flip as many offices that are on the fence into that positive. And I know the Progressive Caucus is very mighty in movement. So if you guys can do that, we'd love it, because we've been at it for like months now. And this last stretch is what we need. And if you can stand with us, we'd really appreciate it. And what Professor Brown said when he said J Beam, this is the greeting of justice. You know how like in Black movements you have power for the people. This is what Dalits say, J Beam, because we're actually referring to Dr. Ambedkar. So it's a greeting of justice, a greeting of freedom, and a greeting of liberty. So J Beam, everybody, and just thank you so much for standing with us. This time next year we'll be celebrating, and can't wait to celebrate with the caucus.
Yes, we're not afraid to call Republicans, and we will send that link out. Thenmozhi, will you email me that link specifically, and we'll send that out in a caucus email, because we can now, because it's endorsed.
Yes.
So yeah,
to call for sure. I'll send them all out.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Sorry for that random Zoom bomber. I've been doing this on Zoom for 4 years now, and that's my first Zoom bomber. So I think it's a pretty good track record. And yeah, I'll see you all on the Signal and on the email, and I will talk to you soon. J Beam, did I say it right?
Yes, you did, J
Beam.
Awesome.
Love you all.
Lots of love.
Bye. Everybody can, you didn't say it if you would like to. Just no Zoom bombing.
J Beam. All right. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.